Welcome to the Law Simplified. I'm Bandaranayake. Today, we will outline and break down a question in relation to purpose trusts.
Advise Natalie, who is considering including the following dispositions in her will. Number 1. £100,000 to my trustees for the promotion of spiritual well-being amongst children in hospices in England. Number 2. £75,000 to my trustees to be used in supplementing the incomes of actors who are earning less than £50,000 per annum. Number 3. £50,000 to my trustees for the protection of endangered species of sparrows in the Amazon. Number 4. £25,000 to my trustees for the purpose of educating the United Kingdom public about vegetarianism and encouraging young people in the United Kingdom to become vegetarians.
When approaching a question on either private or public purpose trusts, it's a good idea to actually firstly have an understanding on where the premise or the basis of such trusts exists. So for instance, if you'd recall back to your understanding of the foundations of trust law and the equitable precepts that go with it, there is a freedom to trust in relation to any individual, as long as the three certainties are fulfilled, namely that of subject matter, of time, and most importantly, in relation to this question specifically and anything in relation to purpose trust for that matter, certainty of objects or beneficiaries. Most trust instruments fail for this failure to establish certainty of objects. Now, when it comes to a purpose trust, it becomes quite a gray area. For instance, when it comes to a court of law, many private purpose trusts have been nullified purely because it is wasteful in nature. Conversely, however, when considering public purpose trusts or charitable trusts as they are referred to, there is even an act which specifies the requirements, primarily considering the fact that a charitable trust will benefit a greater group or a greater class of individuals, and something that maybe a government or a country might have to deal with, an individual has purportedly attempted to do. So because of that, many courts of law, if it's charitable in nature, if it fulfills those requirements, tends to go ahead and allow a charitable purpose trust, even though a subset or a class of objects are not identifiable per se. Now, having said that, when we look at this particular question, it's quite straightforward. And when it comes to an LLB examination or any law degree for that matter, when you have these sort of questions which are posed to you, namely ones which break down the question into 4 or 5 circumstances, it's a good idea to look at each individual circumstance and tackle it one at a time. So to begin with, one of the major elements that we need to outline and identify is the purpose of this particular trust. Now go ahead and make a mental map. I've done so in this question as well. And the first thing that you will understand in relation to the purposes is that the first particular circumstance talks about promotion of spiritual well-being. The second one talks about supplementing the incomes of actors. Third one on the protection of endangered species of sparrows in the Amazon. And finally, educating the United Kingdom public about vegetarianism. Now, once we have identified the actual subject matter or what the purpose that the settlor or the testator is intending to do, the next thing to identify, and this is a secondary component to outline as well, is who these benefits are accruing to. Now, to do so, let's highlight the secondary component of each circumstance. When it comes to the first circumstance, the promotion of spiritual well-being, it is to be amongst children in hospices in England. In relation to the second one, where the supplementing of incomes of actors is concerned, it is for those who are earning less than £50,000 per annum. Now, when you consider the third and fourth, there might not be necessarily such a succinct or outlineable group of people. In the case of the third one, it's not about people whatsoever. Rather, it's merely the protection of endangered species of sparrows in the Amazon. There is no specific outline of who this is to go to or who this is to benefit in terms of a human being. And finally, when it comes to educating the United Kingdom public about vegetarianism, it speaks about encouraging young people in the United Kingdom to become vegetarians. Now, note that young people might amount to a group of individuals, but it's very difficult. It's not workable in the sense that you are unable to identify who amounts to young. It's a very subjective component. Whether a 10-year-old is considered young or whether a 30-year-old is considered young depends on the context in which you speak to somebody. But the first and the second instances, there is a definable or rather quantifiable class of people that has been identified. Children in hospices is a quantifiable finite number of children, while it might be difficult to ascertain. In the second component, those who are earning below £50,000 and may be registered as actors. That too is a subjective matter, but it really depends on the argument you're bringing forward. But once we consider these factors, the next element is to consider what the issues are in relation to this particular question and what the examiner wants you to discuss. So on the one hand, the primary element that you might need to discuss are whether any of the purported dispositions or trust instruments binatally are workable in the first place. We just touched on it briefly earlier when we spoke about this question, the circumstances where, for instance, ascertaining actors. How do you define actors, for example? Whereas the more onus which is created in the fourth circumstances, who amounts to being young. Secondly, do these particular trust instruments, if at all, amount to private or public purpose trusts, charitable in nature for that matter? And finally, whether they are enforceable in any way. Now, it's a good idea to actually outline all of these elements, understand what is required, what the issues are in the question, and to utilize whatever spider graph that you might have developed in order to get a better understanding of each individual topic. A spider graph, specifically in relation to trust law, is actually a great asset because it gives you an understanding of what an examiner might question you on and what bases you might need to hit when attempting a question. Now, if you note the spider graph that is before you right now in this video, we've divided it into both private and public purpose trusts and gone ahead and had discussions based on the various case law as well as statute as well as legislation. Now, if you've gone through certain other questions that I've broken down in relation to first year subjects like contract, criminal, or even constitutional law, you'd note the difference between the style of the spider graph here as opposed to the first year or even when it comes to the third year or very technical subjects like commercial law. The reason being is when it comes to trust law, it's a very argumentative subject, but the law itself is quite succinct and it has been set down. Not in stone, however, but it has been set down to quite an extent. So most of these are in relation to dicta which has been expounded by their lordships in these specific cases on the one hand, as well as certain elements within legislation such as the Charities Act, for instance. Once you have gone through this, it's a good idea to make sure that you formulate and you answer the question at hand, you put it down on paper in a very direct and cohesive manner. Don't be afraid to mark out the various circumstances separately and tackle them individually. It's a false notion to consider by many students that you are expected to write a complete essay in one go. On the contrary, even an examiner will reward you for having clarity of thought and being cohesive in your arguments. So it's a good idea to perhaps, especially for example in this case where you have 4 circumstances, to actually outline each individual circumstance, tackle it as a whole, and then move on to the next. If you are interested in questions of this caliber, as well as how to approach them and how to properly answer them, and perhaps receive feedback on the types of questions that you're writing as well, make sure you visit law.simplybook.me and I'd be glad to arrange a private tutoring session with you. So as always, have fun, stay safe, and obey the law. Cheers.